Muchas gracias a todos por estar aquí. Vamos a ver si se suma más gente, pero en cualquier caso, muy agradecidos de los que estáis, que hayáis venido, de verdad que sí. Además, pues bueno, tanto Álvaro como Daniel son personas bastante relevantes en los estudios del siglo XIX en España actualmente, así que muchas gracias por estar. Bueno, nada, hago una pequeña presentación de Anne, a la que ya conocéis, pero por esto de los formalismos, y luego ya le dejamos tiempo a Anne para que nos presente su libro, ¿vale? Anne Heyer es profesora de Historia Contemporánea en la Universidad de Leiden, en los Países Bajos, y desde sus inicios como investigadora se ha centrado en analizar las ideas y las prácticas alrededor de la participación política en diferentes países europeos desde 1800 hasta la actualidad. Fundamentalmente, ella trabaja sobre Gran Bretaña, los Países Bajos, Alemania y España. Asimismo, se ha interesado por el debate intelectual de carácter transnacional que tuvo lugar entre finales del XIX y principios del XX en Europa acerca de los peligros de la irrupción de las masas en la esfera política. Y una de las cosas que más me apasionan de su trabajo, porque en cierta medida enlazan con lo que yo hago, son que sus investigaciones se han caracterizado siempre por combinar metodologías provenientes de la historia política y de las ciencias políticas. Así, en sus trabajos, y como ella nos contará ahora, pueden encontrarse desde análisis profundos de fuentes primarias hasta el uso de métodos de lingüística computacional para hacer estudios de largo alcance sobre periódicos, sobre bases de datos de periódicos digitalizados, ¿de acuerdo? Lo que va a hacer hoy Anne es básicamente hablarnos de la publicación de su nuevo libro, de The Making of Democratic Party in Europe, 1860-1890. Y, bueno, tampoco me alargo más. Anne, thank you so much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Carlos. I'm going to put on my timer just to make sure that I'm not rambling for hours. And also, please interrupt if some of my connection gets bad or the English gets weird, right? I really want to make sure that everybody, especially if it's a small group, right, that everybody understands. And thanks also much for the kind introduction, Carlos, and having me here, and all of you making time in your afternoons to listen to me and talking about my new book, which is, I think, has a very nice cover, so I'm going to put it out. And I've also learned that it is available online, not only legally, but also less legally. Thanks very much for that information. And I think the best way to start talking about this book is basically talking a little bit about myself. In a way, as often our projects sort of reflect also our biographies as researchers. And so this book is, in a way, as Carlos already said, actually, sort of a reflection on me being in between two disciplines and working on topics that both concern political science and history. And when I started this book, or this project, before it became a book, as a PhD student, I was just done with studying political science, and I moved to history. And the topic that was really important to me were political parties. So the book is, in a way, it is very much a historical project in the sense of that it works with primary sources, very much engages with the historiography, the sort of new trends in political history. It very uses all sorts of different kinds of sources, very sort of personal ones like letters, autobiographies, diaries, but also lots of formal documents, parliamentary debates, manuscripts, brochures, minutes of party congresses, so like sort of a very broad range of the material that these early party founders produced. So in that sense, it's a very sort of conventional, almost political history. I'll later explain why it's maybe not as conventional as you might think, but it also sort of speaks to a more political sciencey debate, and maybe also even like a more general public debate about the crisis of democracy and the crisis of parties today. And so that's also the way how I start this book. I sort of start talking about sort of concerns about the future of democracy and the state of political parties today, and refer to some political scientists who basically say, you know, we're already in a sort of state of post-democracy where democracy is in danger, and one of the main problems in this sort of new era of democratic crisis is our political parties. And they're just not as democratic as they used to be, and they sort of fail in their democratic function. And one of the things that really comes out of the sort of political science literature about political parties is membership and membership decline, so that parties have less members. And that sort of, when I started this project, that was what I was really interested in. So why is it that we think about membership decline as a sort of crucial democratic problem? Because the first original parties had like very few members actually, right? So the sort of idea of the mass party being an essential organization in politics and democracy seemed to be arbitrary to me to some extent, especially because these first party organizations, they had like, so we're talking about like a few thousand members, not hundreds of thousands of members. And then we also know, and that's maybe something that more speaks to the 20th century specialist here, that like, of course, a mass party not necessarily needs to be democratic, right? So there is a sort of weird thing going on there. And that's how I sort of started this journey, if you want to, and sort of try to understand why we came to think about parties as these essential democratic institutions and how parties ended up being these very important institutions for the functioning of democracy. And what I then do in the book is really I sort of look into the very first people who founded the very first modern party organizations in the world, so to say, well, in Europe in a way, but that very much speaks for the world. And then I use a sort of political history perspective to engage with this very current debate, but also, of course, talk to political historians as well. And so the main research question that leads the book is, to put it simply, how and why did parties emerge as political organizations? And for that purpose, to answer that question, I basically sort of start with I use a very broad sort of research design or like sort of approach, if you want to, and that I focus on 3 different countries, which is quite unusual in party research. So I look at Britain, Germany, and the Netherlands. So I sort of start, as Carlos mentioned, I'm sort of starting also doing a bit of research on Spain, but it's very preliminary. So I put it it's in the biography on the university's website, but I haven't published on Spain yet. But so this is more on the sort of more classic Western northern countries. And you might, and the reason I've chosen those 3 countries is, I mean, there's a sort of practical reason of terms of language. So I've learned Dutch for this, but I'm German and I spoke English as well, of course. So it then also made sense in terms of availability of languages and sources. There was another reason, and I think that is maybe a more important reason, and that is that I wanted to use political or look at circumstances that are relatively different in terms of political infrastructure, if you want to talk about political institutions in that way. In terms of suffrage, an important theme in explaining party organizations, with Germany being a relatively authoritarian state in the 19th century, but introducing relatively suddenly universal male suffrage in 1871 or 1867. So it's really like almost out of the blue with the unification of the German state, all men older than 25 get the vote, with the exception of those who are in the military, but I mean quite impressive for many contemporary observers. And that, of course, is like a sort of different story than from Britain, where we have a sort of reform moment, basically, where little by little they extend the suffrage, right? First with the first Reform Act in the 1830s, and then in the 1860s with the Second Reform Act, and then you have more or less 2/3 of the male. This is mainly a book about, or almost exclusively a book about men, I should say. 2/3 of the male population being allowed to vote. And in the Netherlands, you do have again very different story, where there's actually no suffrage rights extension at all until the 1880s. So after the first parties emerge, they decide to extend the suffrage a little bit. But in the 1870s, where you have the first modern parties being founded, 1/3 of the male population is allowed to vote. So a very small percentage of people actually participate formally in politics. So sort of very different political institutions, or in some ways at least. And And also in terms of industrialization, these countries are at very different stages, right? The Netherlands having almost no industrialization, Britain, of course, being the big forerunner, and Germany sort of a latecomer. So that's one thing. It's sort of the national circumstances are relatively different. Then there's another important difference between these cases, namely the sort of specific party organizations that I discuss in the book. They are ideologically, and that's my main point here, they are ideologically very different. So maybe the most famous one, very famous in its period, but also later on, and it has mainly to do with party founders and socialists very much liking to talk about their political work and writing about it, and then giving their organization a lot of fame, are the German Social Democrats. So that's like a party that gets founded in 1869. So in the 1860s, really like a sort of very early form of a mass organization, and sort of the first modern party in Germany. So if you look into the German historiography, people will always say the socialists are the first to found the modern party. Situation is very different, or well, different in Britain, where the first modern party organization is usually the associated with the liberals, and they found an organization that's called formally the National Liberal Federation. So they don't even use the word party yet, right? If you read the contemporary sort of comments in the press, and also then later historians writing about this period, they say this is the first modern type of party in Britain. So it's the liberals who found that. It's known for those of you who are a little bit more acquainted with the 19th century also as the Caucus. So Mosey Ostrogowski, one of the first social scientists, has written about this organization extensively and gave it also sort of a bit of a fame in the literature. And then my third case, the Netherlands, that's probably the least known usually outside of the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, quite famous, is and that I think makes the sort of setup quite interesting, is a hardcore Christian party, so to say. It's Orthodox Protestant, so not Catholic, but Orthodox Protestant party that is founded also by a priest or like a minister, a newspaper editor. His name is Abraham Kuyper. And they call themselves then the anti-revolutionary party. So these guys are basically the anti-socialists, the anti-liberals, so they're sort of a weird conservative group that isn't fully conservative because they use modern techniques of mass mobilization in a way, but their program is really like sort of keeping the existing order sort of in check, and they're very much big fans of the king, of course, and of God. So we do have very different sort of ideological orientations and very different national circumstances. And I use those very different circumstances to figure out what explains the general phenomenon of party organization. So why do people come up in the 1860s until the 1880s, 1890s with this new organization of the party? Yeah, how do they basically innovate political organizations, or like how to do politics in this period? And maybe before I continue talking a little bit, I'm going to give you a little bit more about sort of the theoretical framework of the book, and then I move towards the empirical part, sort of the outcomes, and then towards the conclusion. I should maybe also just very shortly give you sort of a general definition of what I think the modern party is. And that is very much based on the specialized historiography from all these different countries, right? So these cases are known in these countries as the first modern party. But what connects them in terms of sort of the organizational features, so if you want to sort of define them, is this connection between some sort of representation in parliament, right? So they usually have some sort of MP, member of parliament, and an extra-parliamentary organization. And that sort of extra-parliamentary organization means that there's a secretary, a treasurer, a chairman, so like a wider, broader organization that then has a direct link towards parliament. And that makes them sort of a new phenomenon in this period, right? So before that, you have, of course, you have parties, and people also use that word party or Partei, partido in 19th century language, of course. but then they usually either mean a very broad ideological political orientation. So you could be part of the Liberal Party just because you think the Liberals are doing a good job. Or sometimes there's a more specific meaning, and that's the parliamentary faction. So the sort of political elite that is represented in parliament, but then there is no sort of organizational structure behind them. That's the difference, basically. And then you do have, of course, in the 19th century, you do have like early political organizations on a national level, and I come to them a little bit more in detail just in a few minutes, but these sort of organizational structures, they don't have direct representation in parliament. Yeah, they're usually often single issue organizations. Some of them are political, some of them are less political. So you do have like sort of lots of clubs and leagues and associations, but they usually aren't directly represented in parliament. They have a political link somehow, right? They talk to parliamentarians, but they aren't part of the organization. And so these first modern party organizations, they bring these sort of parliamentary guys, the parliamentary representation, together with the sort of extensive group outside of parliament. And it usually involves some sort of formal structure, a couple of offices in terms of like a treasurer and the secretary, as I said, but also party members. So ordinary people joining and becoming somehow related to the party organization, either with like a formal membership card or more informal in the sense that they pay some sort of membership fee or they come to local meetings. Yeah, so like, I mean, at this point, I'm looking really at this moment where they become formalized. So then sort of membership stuff is often a little fluid in terms of that they're still figuring out what they actually want to do, right? Because they don't know what's going to happen afterwards. They don't know yet that democracy is going to become the standard in like 70, 80 years, right? So they're really sort of experimenting with political participation and organization. Let me think. And so, and just to give you a little bit more of the sort of theoretical background of this book, so like, and then I'll really move towards the more empirical part. So generally the literature on parties, and this is also why this book is special also in terms of history, is usually the biography, if you want to say, of one party. So there's lots of publications on parties, of course, one of the most important political institutions, but most of the literature either focuses on one specific party, and that's usually really great in-depth detailed work, or you have a sort of, you have a couple of publications, but these are like usually a little older, where they focus on a party system within a country and how that emerged historically. Or you do have a couple of people who link different countries, but then usually with one ideology. So you do have comparisons, for example, between the Swedish liberals and the German liberals, or you have a fantastic study that shows how the socialists in Britain learned from the organizing techniques of the socialists in Germany, and how, well, that was partially successful, but partially also quite a bit of a failure. So there's a couple of these very specific studies, but the sort of more general party history is usually, when it comes to multiple countries and like sort of a more general phenomenon, is something that political scientists like to do, and I often find their work a little out of touch with the sort of real historical work. They usually have like quite a, if you read that literature, it's usually outdated and in terms of new political history, for example, but it is also sort of assumes a little bit that historians, as I've just read an article where the argument that historians don't do any theory building, so we don't have any theoretical understanding, so we just provide the facts, basically. Yeah? So and with this book, of course, I'm sort of trying to talk through two sides in a way. And the approach then of the book is to, like, in a way then where, again, classic history is to look at party founders or agents, like people who are in a way making a change by sort of acting in politics, like so, but more maybe than their practices, although they are also part of the book. It's really like the way they think about politics, and they start presenting a sort of different narrative to themselves, first of all, right? I think they also explain their actions to themselves, but they also talk to their followers and also legitimize their actions in the broader political system. And I think that sort of ideas part of and not ideas in the sense of intellectual history. So this is not really theoretical, but the sort of way they practically think about politics in a way, right? So the way they sort of think what they can do and what they can do, and that is sort of an understudied part of party emergence or the history of in political parties. And it's very important to understand. It's very important to understand why parties in very different circumstances can actually emerge. And the sort of broader theoretical background of this is, of course, a cultural return in political history, but also a bit of conceptual history, ideas on scripts, for example, but also lots of social movement literature. These early parties, because they are so uninstitutional in a way that they have like a very social movement sort of feeling, and in social movement theory you have like this idea of framing, so that you can look at, if you start looking at reality or circumstances in a different way, it allows you to mobilize people and become politically active, even if the risks are maybe actually quite high. Yeah. So if you start thinking differently about your reality, or you find like a sort of new way of looking at your reality, you will be able to do new things. And so I'm using these party founders and basically sort of try to understand how they start thinking differently about their, or present also their reality differently to their followers, to convince people actually to become part of their movement and part of their organization. Okay, so that's sort of the broader theoretical sort of embedding of the book, which I think is important in a way because in some ways the book then, as I explained, is a little unusual. I also feel it's always important to explain what it tries to do. Okay, and then I thought I start the more sort of empirical, like sort of real part with a bit of a quote, and that so that comes from the second chapter. And I start with the Dutch case, mainly because I know that's not so appealing, but I feel like in terms of writing, I thought it's important to put the Dutch case first, because people usually know the socialists, that's easier to understand. So I always like try to sort of start with the like sort of understudied or less known Dutch case. And so this in 1872 already, so before this Orthodox Protestant minister founds this anti-revolutionary party, this big success in the Netherlands, like one of the most important politicians, he becomes one of the most important politicians in the Netherlands, was prime minister at some point. So long before that, he's just founds his own little political newspaper, which is called the Standard. He writes about the German socialists. So there's like a short moment where you can actually see that these people actually look and learn from each other. And he says in that article, so first of course, he goes like, sort of criticizing the socialists in Germany. He says, they're threatening and undermining the social order, should really not be trusted. These guys are revolutionaries. Best is to lock them up and, well, never ever open the prison doors ever again, in a way. But then he also says something, and I think that is important. He says, he sort of starts praising them, and he says, they do actually well in terms of organization. There's a powerful unity in their movement, and they have great organizational skills. So you can read this guy basically sort of like really attacking socialism, which is his natural enemy, but there's also sort of a respect. The socialists in Germany, the thing that they do very well and what makes them successful in a weird way, although they are dangerous people, is their organization techniques. And I think that is a very important element if you look at early party organizations. It comes up over and over again. The sort of idea of organization as a powerful instrument. Some 19th century contemporaries even say that organizations are like machines, like locomotives. Yeah, this is the age of industrialization. So they are like sort of almost like a sort of technical instrument to change politics. Yeah, you put a lot of coal or steam in it, and then it can like exercise a lot of power. Yeah, it's sort of an idea that organizations can change politics drastically. Yeah, and they first think about it in terms of social initiatives, civil society stuff, sort of improving society, and then they start thinking about this sort of instrument in terms of politics. And in this second chapter, so like the first real chapter in the book, I sort of try to show that this sort of organization element is very important to convince party founders and many people in this period that it is worth joining a political party, although there's almost very little suffrage rights, very little political influence, almost nothing to gain. But if you work together, you might actually have a shot of changing politics. And there is like one famous example, I think, that shows that very well. And that also shows up in all these three cases. And that's the Anti-Corn Law League, like a very famous early 19th century, I see Alvaro nodding, 19th century political organization, a pressure group that in Britain, that organizes nationally to with a sort of national movement to pressure a conservative government to change tariffs. So like a sort of economic policy. And the thing, what makes this case so important for like all of 19th century Europe, probably also Spain, I would assume, I don't know, but is that they're actually successful. So it's a liberal movement and forces a conservative government to change its course. And that's sort of like, that's an eye-opener for many people. And of course, like then the obvious guys who like work with this sort of idea are the liberals, or the guys who found the liberal first modern party organization in the UK. But there's also another, but sort of idea also travels to the socialists in Germany. For example, Karl Marx, who is in London at this time in exile, writes about the Anti-Corn Law League, but also other socialists write about it, and they say we want something similar. We want sort of a national organization that can influence politics. And we want like sort of we want to connect ordinary people, we want to organize them, and then we want to force the government to change its policies. And then in the Netherlands, this sort of anti-revolutionary party makes actually the predecessor of this organization is a organization called the Anti-Schoolwetverbond, so the Anti-School Law League, and they basically call themselves like the Anti-Corn Law League, and that's not a coincidence. So they use the same sort of like almost organizational design, and they say like, although these guys are liberals and we really don't like them, the organizational techniques are successful and we can use them to reach our goals by organizing a lot of people, like, you know, like a lot of ordinary people, and pressure government. So that sort of idea is basically, I think it's influential in essential in understanding how these people in very different political circumstances and very different socioeconomic circumstances actually come up with this or think that there actually is worth organizing and founding a political party. And then the next argument I make in the book, so I'm sort of showing the sort of transnational indirect often exchange of ideas, where these sort of ideas about organization float. And then I sort of move more towards like the specific cases that I'm studying in the book. And one of the important things and one of the things that really surprised me was that all these three party organizations emerge out of an education movement. So these parties, they get founded, but before that, there's an organization, there's always like some sort of national organization that is more social or more philanthropic or sort of like civil society based, that has a sort of education agenda. Yeah, so there's the Anti-School Law League, the one that I just mentioned in the Netherlands, but then also the liberals actually, they first have a national education league. And the Germans, German socialism actually emerges out of a educational association national network. So education sort of like, so all these organizations emerge out of education, and these movements are all, they're more social and political, and most of these leaders actually do argue that politics is like, well, you can maybe think about influencing politics, but you shouldn't use ordinary people. So for a long time, these movements exist, or well, for a decade, without them going political. So they're very careful in sort of making the sort of political step, and the elites within these movements, or the sort of leaders of these movements, they sort of resist politicization. So it's very clearly a sort of, we don't talk about politics. We might do a bit of politics, but let's be careful of not involving parliament too much, and definitely let's not involve ordinary people. Let's first teach them a few things, you know, like make sure that they actually understand how politics works, but let's not mobilize them. Let's be very careful in not creating a situation where we would sort of end up with a revolution. You know, that's sort of dangerous idea that's floating around in the 19th century. And what happens then with time is that, and that's why I've talked about a sort of agency element, is that a few very small group in these movements actually starts thinking about politics differently. So there's the sort of organization is available already, but these people like sort of get frustrated with not achieving anything. But it's a very small group, yeah. And in all these movements, there's a moment where basically they get to a point where they don't achieve anything, or like they sort of get rejected because they have like a big petition, for example, and Parliament says no, and then they start going political. But it's like there's sort of like one or two people who think, or like a very small group within those movements that sort of decide to go political, and that often means that the sort of education movement splits from the political group, and the sort of more political people found the political organization of the party. And the idea of the party is then, and that's why the book is called The Making of the Democratic Party, is very much based on sort of general ideas of democracy in the sense of involving ordinary people in politics. Some of these political organizers use the word democracy, like by the Social Democrats, call themselves Democrats as well. And also the anti-revolutionaries actually say at some point, well, we don't really like the idea of democracy, but that's what's going to happen, so we better go with it and, you know, like sort of organize ordinary peoples to our interests. So the key sort of principle of these first political parties, if you look at the founding Congress, where they basically found a new organization without knowing that it will be a political party, is not so much of like, we're going to go into parliament and influence parliament, but it's we're going to create a political organization that has a broad political program. Yeah, we don't only focus on education, but we have like a wide range of issues, and we will mainly represent, or we will present ordinary people's interest in politics, maybe parliament. Yeah, so there's a sort of clear understanding of we want to involve ordinary people in politics through our organization. Normally, like either there's like often there is no suffrage rights, even if there's suffrage rights, they are not sufficient. We really want to create a political environment for these people. And want to make sure then that their interests are heard in politics. That's the main argument. That's what's happening at these founding congresses. But it's sort of, they don't know where they're going, but it's sort of, that's what connects them. Yeah, the sort of idea that a mass organization with membership, with a broad political program, and some sort of hopeful link that is not yet really formally established in some of these organizations, the parliament, will help them change first politics, or the sort of situation in parliament often, and then also change society. So that's why, and they basically the sort of idea of democracy in the broadest 19th century sense of the word, or popular politics. That's more like a term that appears in the British case. Yeah, so the people's politics. Defines those organizations. So from the beginning, when the modern party emerges, there's a sort of sense of ordinary people being involved in politics, sort of what from a 19th century perspective, now from 20th century perspective is more complicated, but is democratic in its essence, if we sort of break down the idea of democracy. There's also a strong sense that structures are important and that you want to avoid, and that's what I then show in the next chapter, that you want to sort of make sure that you don't have two dominant leaders. So they are sort of aware of the problem that if you involve, or if you build a mass organization, almost like sort of foreseeing almost like a totalitarian sort of stuff that's happening in the 20th century. They say like, one of the things that we really need to make sure is that we don't have an authoritarian leader that controls all the masses, tells them lies, gives them sort of an emotional story, and then they're going to sort of stupidly follow the political leader. And they develop different strategies to deal with that. And I'm going to sort of not go into detail with that because of the time. So at the founding moment, like these congresses, this sort of idea of democracy is very important. And then later, when they develop these sort of ways of how to organize this sort of democratic system, one of the main arguments is like, let's be careful with strong political leaders. Let's make sure that everybody can get involved in politics in a sort of free or meaningful way, in the widest sense of the word. Let me just check the time, because Yeah, I'm going to skip the part about elections because, as I said at the beginning, elections at this moment aren't so important. They are more important to, as a parliament, sort of, they are represented in parliament, but often these parliamentary fractions are relatively independent. And what you see is that the organization, the membership organization, is used to discipline the parliamentary fraction often. Yeah, so there is a sort of like winning elections is not necessarily at the beginning the most important sort of drive or factor of party organization. No, it's actually sort of building a political organization, and that's value in itself in a way. Okay, let me think if I think I'll leave it at that and like sort of conclude more generally. So what I do in the book is I try to show that, or I hopefully successful, show that sort of in this sort of moment when the party gets found, the modern party emerges, there is a sense of democracy. And I very much like what Rosa Valland said about democracy as a concept, and that's always a solution and a problem. So these party founders present democracy, so involving ordinary people in politics, as a solution to the social problems of the time. Like by involving ordinary people, we will be able to change politics, and by that we'll create better societies. But it remains a problem because, like in the sort of geographical big space of the nation state, you end up with sort of a representative system, which means that democracy, and they often think about direct democracy and participation, is sort of gets inherently complicated. Yeah, so there's always like sort of a sense of we create a solution, but at the same time it's basically also almost impossible to implement in practice. And you could argue, if you look at the membership numbers, and that sort of connects what I said at the beginning of my talk, that there's very few members in these early party organizations, so they are actually sort of fake democratic, right? You could always say they use that sort of democratic narrative to legitimize their actions or their grip for power, and they are like very sort of cynical political agents or historical actors in many ways. And you could read it like that. I think that's sort of in there. But, and some of the, usually people don't say that for the socialists, they usually get a better treatment, but if you read the literature about these Orthodox Protestants or the hardcore Christians, it's usually quite negative. And also for the liberals, there's sort of there's lots of criticism in the way they organize their members. But there's also like, so you could read this as a sort of cynical power grabbing, and democracy is only like a sort of story they use, or ordinary people to get power. But I think there's also a different story, and that comes out of this sort of experience for these political leaders, but also members, and that is like being in a political organization in this period is already a political act in itself. It is really like, this is a moment where members might not have a full say, but they actually get involved in politics. Yeah, there's an environment where they actually have some sort of influence. They get to determine who their leaders are in one way or the other, either the local, international leaders, and they actually sort of create a political environment. There's a political project where they are immediately involved, and symbolically in some ways, but also practically or procedurally in some other ways. And I think that is, and it is, if you also look at the biographies of these party leaders, these are not people who sort of, not all of them, like these are political careers who are like very, very difficult. They basically, they go against the current of their times, they risk a lot. They are sort of, the best thing that can happen to them is sort of like sort of a nervous breakdown, burnout situation which happens. But some of them go to prison for their political beliefs. Yeah, so in a way they believe what they're saying, and in a way they create a political organization that is, in many ways, or provides a democratic experience to their members that I think is crucial and meaningful, and not only a narrative. So there's sort of a myth in the sense of that they are a mass organization, which they aren't. They are like relatively small, also in terms of 19th century political organizations that usually, some have 10,000 members. But they are, and they also don't provide all their members with equal influence, but they provide some influence, and they sort of have some sort of bigger mass organization in the making. And I think this is sort of shows us also that the sort of ideas about democracy and the things we assume about democracy, and I think that's usually what history can do very well, needs to be questioned again and again, and really like think about what we actually mean with the sort of concepts that we work with. And with that, I think I'm very much in the 35 minutes that I was given by Carlos, and I'll leave it with that. Thanks so much for listening.
Okay, thank you, Anne, for your interesting presentation. And now we go to the question time. So
question time.
I suppose that Daniel and Alvaro have many questions. So
yeah, I'm looking forward to reading the books before making real interesting questions. I don't know anything about political parties because I'm working on the first half of the 19th century and everything. But I found very interesting this idea that an anti-revolutionary party could be seen as a founding member of or a model to establish a comparison with the traditional, modern political parties. And it's a very schematic and sample question. Do you think that counter-revolutionaries, anti-revolutionaries are really part of the foundation of modern politics, or that they were copying, appropriating the practices that were actually created by liberals and socialists? Because it's one of the problems I encounter in the middle of the 19th century, when in France, if you know, the legitimists, they use all the vote, public opinion, mass, and they create the Montagne Blanche, a political organization that is mimicking the radical political parties, Republicans in France, by using a social but counter-revolutionary and legitimist discourse to attract the working classes. Are they just copying, or are they part of the creation of modern political parties?
So I think there's two things to say. Let me start more with the sort of very practical historical stuff, and then I make a more general theoretical almost argument. So I would argue that like the sort of copying and sort of using techniques that are out there for a longer period that exists, that's there all the time. And I think it's, of course, it's mainly sort of what we consider progressive forces that come up with this sort of repertoire, but not exclusively. But often people who study social democracy find confusing is that like most of the social democratic repertoire is actually liberal repertoire, right? Bourgeois repertoire. So like the sort of workers' stuff that actually originally comes from sort of very liberal, radical liberal tradition. So there's sort of a link there. But then you could argue, of course, that those liberals are, of course, sort of progressive. In the Netherlands, the sort of very almost populist style of politics, the sort of party organization, I think that is it is really something that these Christian Orthodox people do, or Protestant Orthodox do, and it comes out of a church movement, right? So there's a sort of church tradition of organizing, and that is, I mean, and you could argue then that Protestantism is also sort of liberal, right, or progressive, or in the sort of wider, I mean, like sort of Calvinist thinking is, of course, it's sort of a sort of criticism of Catholicism, but that I think like that is very much putting also like a sort of 21st century stamp on, or 20th century stamp on these movements, right? Where we say these are the progressive guys and these are the sort of reactionary guys. I think in that, and that sort of, these sort of categories do matter as well in the 19th century, but they matter differently, yeah? So this Abraham Kuyper, for example, he is considered by most of the Protestant Orthodox elite as like a guy who's sort of out of line, right? By organizing, involving ordinary people in politics with this party organization, and really like sort of having these extremely emotional political speeches, and really like sort of talking about his experience as a sort of religious leader, but also political leader, and very much becoming the embodiment of like ordinary Orthodox Protestants. It's like that's unique, I think, in the sort of Dutch circumstances. And of course, he takes this sort of organizing techniques, then again, like partially from the socialists in Germany, although he would never formally admit that, right? Or in some other ways, also from this sort of anti-chronologic examples. But like sort of this idea of that there is an original technique, and this comes from a progressive, and then the conservatives are only stealing that, or anti-progressive forces. I think that doesn't really work for the 19th century, because nobody really knows yet where it's sort of if you know how the story ends, it makes sense, but it doesn't make sense for these people in this context, I would argue. And they sort of, what I think, like, for the the Dutch case is nice because it sort of helps me to sort of counteract the normal argument about socialists founding the mass organization, or basically liberals in a way. And they do sort of push the, Michael Angel, they sort of push the democratic narrative in the Netherlands. In a sort of weird way, but they do, right? So you could argue that the populism, conservative populism is essentially, it is part of it advances the democratic repertoire, if you want to use repertoire as a word. And we know that there's a sort of dangerous momentum where it can also, again, go into the totalitarian states, right? But we need, like, in the Netherlands, the sort of the anti-revolutionary party is considered to be the first modern party. So it is the moment where basically, like, the sort of repertoire of the party, or like the sort of organization of the party, appears in the Netherlands. And basically it happens before the socialists organize. Yeah, so they need that example, basically, as a political organization.
Okay, thank you. Really interesting.
Yeah, do you agree, or?
I think the problem is that there is this teleology of modernity, and because researchers of the counter-revolution, we have to justify that our actors are political. So when we say they also use these repertoires, everybody thinks that, okay, they use it because they learn it from the actual, creators of this repertoire. I think that people are experimenting with different ways of making politics, and since the ways are not close, we don't have this from today's perspective of the evolution of this modernity. So of course, people are using all kind of different media to how they will not use press, even if they were supporting a regime where press was not free. How will they not use mass meeting, even if they have? It's absurd, but it's like we have to claim the legitimation of our topic. We still have to convince people that counter-revolutionary were making actual politics, and that we don't agree with them in the past, but that we understand the way of making politics. But on the contrary, there are also people saying, exaggerating, saying that counter-revolution was as revolutionary as the revolution, and that counter-revolutionary were as modern as, and I think that this also problematic, this idea of, because they were actually reacting against something, and I don't know, it's complex, but I like to see an anti-revolutionary party in this kind of comparison, and I think it's very interesting.
And I sort of, one of the, like, the original, I think, title of the project was like the making of the modern party. And I sort of dropped modern because that was on so many levels difficult to argue. And I understand that democratic is difficult as well. But I think that that's also why I had this long story about this sort of political science literature in a way, right? And what they think makes a party democratic. And that is often quite, they also sort of, there's lots of different ideas why a party became, like intra-party democracy, the position in the party in the political system, mass membership. But then what's mass membership? Do you need to have 100,000 members? Is 10,000 members enough? Right? Do you need to have a party law? Or it's like, in the Netherlands, we famously have this party that has only one member, which is a right-wing populist party. So that, right, where are these parties democratic or not, right? So there's sort of, it's quite difficult to determine these things. So I think, like, in a way, using that term sort of explain, because I'm putting that on the line. I'm saying, that let's think about what it actually means. And let's look at the sort of historical meaning and sort of elements that actually appear historically already. I didn't eventually ended up writing that paper, but when I was in Madrid, me and my supervisor, we were sort of thinking about sort of democratic values in the widest sense of the word, like, and he was working on anti-slavery movements, sort of like more liberal sort of movements that nobody should be owned by somebody. And we were sort of thinking about writing a paper together about these anti-revolutionaries who also sort of have had like some sort of core values together with these anti-revolutionaries who are never really considered as democratic actors, but there is some sort, I mean, they contribute to that history, right, in some ways.
But I've noticed that you use like democratic and popular politics, like not synonyms, but you are saying is democratic, is popular, ordinary people participating in popular. And for the first half of the 19th century, popular politics are not democratic. I mean, and popular participation because they don't respect difference. I mean, they are not totalitarian, but they want to exclude the enemy of the political field. So they are popular, they are grassroots movement, but not democratic at all. So I think that we should also make this different because one thing is democratic.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm basically, I mean, I'm using these. I think I explained relatively well that there's sort of this understanding of involving ordinary people in politics, and that's of course a very limited and very broad, at the same time, broad definition of democracy that works, I think, well for the 19th century context. Popular politics comes, so I use the language that these people use. Like, so I explain, like, so I look at when they use, and of course the word democracy also doesn't mean in this context what it means today, you know? I mean, there's these sort of liberal values, for example, they're not part of the democratic vocabulary, you know? When I talk about democracy, they usually mean sort of a Rousseauian, we all meet under the tree and then we vote together every day and do as a small scale community. People don't think about this in sort of like nation state, at least not the sources that I know for the 1860s to 1890s, huh? So they use democracy, but they sort of they don't think about their political systems as democracies. Yeah, they think about their projects, maybe their ideologies. They use that sort of vocabulary, but it's just slowly emerging what it could actually mean for the nation state, right? But none of the states are democracies in the first place, but also what they mean with democracy is different still. And I think the reason why the British radical, like these are sort of the radical branches of the liberals, but they don't use democracy is because they think it's French Revolution in the right. So that's why they stay away from that sort of literature. But yeah, it's a fascinating question. Yeah, sorry for like basically using this for like sort of a side talk. Yeah.
Really interesting. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. Really great question. Yeah. Any other questions?
If you have any question, okay, Nicolas.
Yeah. Thanks, Anne, for the talk. And I lost my connection during a while, so maybe I'm going to ask a question that you already answered. So I apologize in advance. And I was kind of shocked when you talk about the elections and the importance of the elections in the construction of the new parties. Like you kind of put out the elections process out of the focus of the main political parties. And I was thinking about the memoirs of Alexis de Tocqueville. It could be considered like the typical liberal figure, and but not really. He's a theorist. He's a theorist for democracy, and he's one of the first who understands that democracy is going to come no matter how, no matter what we do. So we better take that into control and put the masses into the right way of how to get on participation, etc. But in his memoirs, he also recognized that he was moved by the way in which the people were mobilized going to the elections and all about the elections process and the fact the action of voting and all that implies into that. So could you please explain a little bit more what elections, why you think elections are not so important in the compared to what is the parliamentary process, etc. And my second question, or the second part of the same question, would be, I really miss like some more examples, like personal examples of what kind of leaders are we talking about, and could you give us 2 or 3 examples of thinkers, of the leaders, of the political parties that because we don't have to forget the personal part of creating a political party. It depends very much whether we like it or not on charisma, on people who are really get like the symbol of a political movement, etc. So I kind of miss this this presence of thinkers like Tocqueville when they talk about the political masses into politics, and about Max Weber for the German case. And so could you explain a little bit more what's the relationship between the leader, the masses, and the structure of the political parties? Thank you.
Let me think. There's so many things to say about this. So maybe I'll start with the second part, because I just had ideas about that, and then I move towards the elections, which is sort of a standard question I usually get, so that's sort of maybe easier to answer. So, I mean, in the book, it is very much about these people who, right, I mean, that was not an empty statement in the talk. It is about the people who found these organizations, and these are less thinkers and more doers in some ways, right? So I'm not interested. So I'm not actually interested in what Karl Marx says. He is sort of in, and that is different from the sort of more part of the party historiography is very much interested in the sort of ideological sort of currents. I'm not interested in that in a way. I'm more interested in the sort of in what these people think practically about politics. It's sort of a conceptual history of doing politics in a so. And that doesn't mean that I don't think intellectual history is not important. I sort of read these things as well, right? And they sort of inform what I do in the background. And I do, very much at the beginning of the book, I also refer to these very obvious players in the room who then, in the early 20th century, look back at these developments like Max Weber, Ostrogowski, but also Michels, for example, and sort of try to understand these party organizations. But they are at the end of an era, in a way. But they look back at this period with a very, they are at the end of the era, and at the same time are very much in this political situation. So they're sort of trying to make sense of what happened earlier and sort of also positioning themselves in the political system, right? So Max Weber is, of course, talking about charisma and also about procedural legitimacy, and I think I'm sort of using his categories also in the book, so that to organize a little bit my research. So they're there, but I'm like in the book, I'm more interested about the people who actually do politics, not those, and there is of course a connection, right? I'm not denying that, but those who actually sort of do the actual organizational work. Yeah, so the guys who actually, and they do hold political speeches, they go to parliament, but they do very practical politics. And that is partially because I would argue that you can't understand these organizations if you look at the thinkers, because the thinkers don't do a thing, right? And also these first socialists, I mean, they partially read Marx, well, they read the Communist Manifesto, but they hardly read his Kapital, right? Because that's way too theoretical for them. So they don't have the time, right? They sort of really are busy, like sending letters all day, holding speeches, traveling. Sometimes they go to parliament to present speeches, but that's like a small minority at the beginning, like 2 people basically in parliament. And they're just very busy, and they do have a normal job, right? Because somebody basically needs to pay for the bread on the table. And that's also true for for the liberals, it's also true for the anti-revolutionaries. They do have they do politics on the side in a way to their sort of normal income, and partially make money out of politics as well. But, you know, it's like, it's like, they basically have sketches like we do have, like poor academics have sometimes, right? Like lots and lots of over hours. So I'm interested in understanding what they think. Yeah, so I'm reading less of the sort of theoretical literature, which is there, right? And especially like sort of the later thinkers are important because I sort of use them to criticize ideas about parties. But I'm interested in these sort of people who do practical politics, and what are the connections between these people. And I think if you look at them from a sort of more social history perspective, you see that there are people who usually are quite intelligent, and they are capable of organizing. There's often charisma because they need to be able to rhetorically to appeal to people, but there's also like very much a lot of administrational work going on that is very, very important. Often that work gets split up. So there are some people who do sort of the appealing work, like sort of talking, and there's other people who do more sort of background organizational stuff. Not all the time, but most of the time. And there are people who are, they're sort of, they have the capacity to sort of climb up the social ladder or the political ladder, but because of their socioeconomic status, because they're not part of the old elite, they can't have influence. So they don't get voted into parliament in the old system because they don't come from the old aristocracy, or they don't have an income that allows them to afford a political office. So in a way, you could also sort of think about these people as sort of people who are making the most of their opportunities. Yeah. So by organizing the masses, they sort of develop a new type of politician. So that's work that I'm doing right now, basically, where these people are sort of, they're stuck in the old system, but they have the capacity, they have the sort of education, the training, the ability, the sort of, well, mind to basically be able to theoretically get out of these social economic structures that they're in. They're all like sort of, they're part of either, so August Bebel, like the most famous social democratic organizer, he's a small craftsman, he has a few people working for him, but in the sort of old sort of class system in Germany, he would never get a political office, right? So, but he does read, right? And he's well, like not super theoretically, he doesn't have university training, but he went through different schools. So more than just like a normal industrial worker. The first socialists, they're often like, none of them is really like an industrial worker. These first Socialist Party founders, they're all sort of, they have some sort of education, some even the university education, but then they get impoverished because their family can't afford any, right? These are usually people who are sort of, they are sort of above their class, if you want to, and something is also true for the National Liberal Federation, where Joseph Chamberlain, the most important founder, is an industrial entrepreneur, and when he enters parliament, everybody makes fun of him because he doesn't understand the rules of the old aristocracy, right? He, for example, he wears a hat when he gets sworn into his parliamentary office. And everybody's like, well, what is this guy doing? You know, he doesn't belong here. So it's people who don't belong into political office, but they actually have the capacity to do so. So in some way, they find another way to get access, right? So you could, again, tell a very cynical story. And they're usually good speakers, good writers, and very good organizers. So that's maybe answering sort of your first part of the question, your second part, I mean. And then the first part about elections, yeah, I love that question because, so this is of course the classic political science argument that parties get founded to win elections, basically. But then if you look at these sort of 19th century context, and also, and I think that's what historians can do very well, the chronology of things, then you see that these first party organizations, sort of the setup of the organizational structure and the idea of having a broad political program and connecting this parliamentary small group with the sort of extra-parliamentary organization appears before suffrage gets extended. So often before suffrage extension, these party organizations get founded. And there is no way for these sort of political outsiders, as I just explained, to know what's going to happen, right? So they don't know that suffrage rights get extended. So they just have this idea. So for all these parties, they have relatively little influence in politics, and there is not really like a sort of expectation that that's going to change soon. So they don't have a way to foresee that basically everybody's going to get voting rights after the Second World War, right, or men and women then. It's not, or like after the First World War, but so that is not there yet. So they don't, I mean, that's happening in some system, and that also has to do with them sort of partially also criticizing electoral rights. So the first socialists, when they get confronted with universal male suffrage in Germany, they say, well, this is an authoritarian state. it gives voting rights to the people, but basically you can't achieve anything because parliament is powerless. So then, like, the sort of idea that we have about democracy, where voting is the direct link towards basically making democracy work through political parties, that doesn't exist for these people yet. Right, so that sort of link isn't there yet. They don't think about politics in that way, because often it's easier to create a sort of pressure organization and sort of make a lot of fuss to influence government, because government is also often independent from parliament as well, right? So that's why elections at this period don't matter so much. And the sort of why many of the, like, sort of Duverger, for example, why thinks about it, like talks, or like many of the sort of core political science readings on this era talk about elections, is because in the British case, right, English being available, a language like that everybody reads as well, Moseo Surovsky, a Russian intellectual who then goes to Sciences Po, of course, and writes first in French and then gets translated into English, writes about the National Liberal Federation, so the liberal case that I'm also studying, and they present themselves as an electoral machine. But historians have studied the first years of these parties, or like the first 2-3 decades, and they say, like, electorally they actually they present themselves as very efficient, but they don't make a difference in elections. So they sort of like pretend to be electorally successful, and they're the only ones who directly say, you know, we are like an electoral machine. The others actually don't. At the beginning, like at the moment, so I'm really interested in this moment when a party organization gets founded. 1, 2, 3 decades later, of course, elections are very important and they stabilize the organization. So my argument would be, like, parties don't get funded to win elections, but once they are founded, they actually, then elections help stabilize the organization. And the reason why these organizations have such a why they become successful is because of elections, but they don't get founded for that. So, and I can talk about this forever. This favorite question of, yeah.
And last but not least, what about women? Do they play a role in organization with first political parties, and what about getting the mass mobilized and etc.?
Yeah, that's yeah. I wish I would have done a little bit more about women in the book. So I sort of feel, but I would have required this, again, totally different type of research in a way. And this has been already quite an intensive project. So women, of course, don't take formal political office. They can't, at this, and I'm really talking about this very early period of parties again, right? I need to emphasize, I really understand why they emerge. So they can take formal political office, and they also don't appear in the political writings of the parties. But then if you dig deeper into the biographies of these party founders and the functioning of the organization, you see women like sort of pop up on the sidelines, but really like on the sidelines in a way, right? They're not part of the formal documents, right? They're sort of difficult to find. But a nice example is when socialist leader August Bebel gets convicted and needs to spend one year maybe in prison, then his wife actually makes sure that he gets his letters from the party organization. Yeah, so there is a sort of, they help make the organization work, but they're, I mean, the material that I've seen, and again, you know, we need to be very careful sort of interpreting the sources because they have a strong male bias, of course. And there is also ideas about masculinity in these organizations that have to do with public space and being a little, almost having sort of a rowdy, rough sort of ability to speak to a crowd, right? That's sort of, and sometimes these meetings also get quite physical and there's some fists involved. That seems to be a quite, I'm looking at Alvaro because I know that, but in these sort of settings, that seems to be a quite male sort of, and that's for this period. I think that's different in different circumstances in the 19th century, right? There's like people like Beatrice Webb, who is like the famous socialist leader of like the sort of very turn of the century, who sort of, for example, has a short affair with Joseph Chamberlain, right? And so she helps me, like sort of her diary, for example, is a very good source because she's really good in sort of observing what's happening politically. But of course, she never speaks, right? Oh, well, actually, she speaks at one meeting. Yeah. So there's like these occurrences, but unfortunately, they don't. I hate to say this, but they don't drive the story, right? In a sort of material. I think one could write about these women and people have done that as well. But they are a part of the story, but they're not sort of the essential sort of figures that do the organizing, right? Often you see in the letters, because I mean I have lots of letters, that then there's like sort of reference of like my wife says hi to your wife, that sort of stuff. Then they appear, but yeah, and it doesn't mean that gender isn't in the story, but as I said, there's masculinity and sort of ideas about masculinity in this period. But also what a politician is, and what, like sort of in the widest sense of the word, that becomes more and more sort of a male dominion. And arguably, and that's not my idea, other people have said that, with the formalization of parties, or like of popular politics in parties, or that sort of politics actually sort of formalizes those sort of gender roles, in the sense of that men actually do, because from the beginning men get all these formal offices. But then there's no place for women for a very long time. And you see that later, even in the early 20th century, when women try to enter that domain, they have no chance. Also because then it becomes a full-time job, or full-time plus job, and women can't afford doing that.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions?
Can I suggest, like, I want to ask something for to the 20th century, or also to other specialists. I sometimes think about this period as this sort of like enthusiasm for mass politics and involving ordinary people as sort of a moment where there is like, you can tell the story to, or people who aren't professional historians maybe, or like to the outside in two ways. Namely that it's sort of the beginning of sort of this sort of nice democratic story, right, where we end up with the sort of democratic systems of the second half of the 20th century. But of course, this sort of idea of organizing the masses, right, the concept of the masses is very important, right, the sort of quantity of members, of course, has this link also to these totalitarian systems, right? So there's a sort of, and both are in these early party organizations, but also, as Alvaro mentioned already, they are partially quite populist and quite manipulative as well, right? I mean, they pretend that they are sort of want to keep powerful leaders in check. But I mean, there is a few people also among the socialists who really run the show. And that's, as I said, I think still there's more room for ordinary people to get involved in politics than in any other setting, or in many other settings in this period. But there's still this sort of, seems to be the seeds for these sort of developments in both ways. I'm sort of wondering whether that's something that speaks to the 20th century crowd, or whether that seems to be like a sort of very weird idea. Okay, I see. Apparently no.
Daniel.
Nicolás, so you want to reply to Anne?
I'm not sure of having understood. What was? Could you precise again your question?
Yeah, so like this period that I study for the book, so the 1860s until 1890s,
yeah.
And sort of first mass parties, right? Sort of they basically talk about the masses without having mass membership yet, but the concept, the idea is there already. And the sort of mobilization of ordinary people for political reason, but in this sort of very formalized structures. I think you can tell the story in two ways. So you can say that actually influences the sort of 20th century sort of democratization process, and this is parts of the beginning of democratic parties. But of course, these are also the moment where basically we have this sort of seed for like sort of fascist regimes later on, right? The sort of totalitarian state. And I'm wondering whether that's something that sort of speaks to you, and I know that some of you actually also work on totalitarianism and fascism, or whether that seems to like I just find it interesting that these sort of two possible outcomes are sort of possible, like basically can come from this sort of moment. Basically, you can look at it like in sort of, if you look at it from sort of sense of modernity or democratization or how things developed, that there's basically these two trajectories available, and also, I mean, we see that, you know.
Concerning the 1930s, I think it got much to do with both the socialist parties and but also with the Catholic parties. I mean, when the church and the state are taken apart, and the Catholics got to organize themselves, and I think about the Italian or the French case, they developed the parties which. I can assume that there's the real, like the first massive political parties where they're actually looking for mass participation of ordinary people, and but without losing that verticality that they got from the very beginning until the end of the 19th century. But we can see how they develop a new kind of a structure, and much more professionalized one, with attention for the media, particularly with the press, and they developed the specific sections of the political parties devoted to specific communities, like target communities, like young people, women, and as the women get more involved in politics and they ask for voting rights, and that actually women are actually one of the key factors for mobilization of the ordinary people. And correct me if I'm wrong, but as the socialists are very reluctant to use this kind of target communities because they are based more on class struggle, and they consider that in the same class they don't have to have differences between the different communities inside the class. But the Catholics are much more modern in the way of understanding politics, because they create a specific section for youngs. Even young people till they're 25 or 23 in France and 25 in Spain, they don't have the right to be a member of a political party. But despite of that, they create their own sections for youngers, for women, for media, and it's also the beginning of the first think tanks inside the party, and that's a factor for mobilizing ordinary people. And but they don't lose that verticality, I would say, till the global 60s of the 20th century, because there would always be a kind of a elite and aristocracies, even in socialist or communist parties. There will always be like the elite and with family ties and relevant family names. They won't lose that verticality till very late in the 20th century. So I wouldn't say that there's a lot of change in the structure of the political parties all along since the end of the 19th century till the very end of the 20th century.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I think then again you need to be very specific what you mean, right? Like, so there's sort of all sort of different, like, so I agree that sort of the basic setup remains intact, or like the basic function. I would argue that that's actually still intact, right? I mean, sort of if you have a membership organization, almost all parties have like a treasurer, president, and they have local chapters and the national headquarters, and then a parliamentary faction. I mean, that's there, right? So, but then there is, right, exactly, so that's sort of like really putting the finger on what is actually changing. I think that is maybe the most important job of a historian, really being very specific and then putting that in the sort of context of its time, right? So the sort of think tank, or for example, the press, right? I mean, that's a 19th century phenomenon as well. Like all these parties have press already. Actually, the press is there before the party comes, in a way, right? So to construct that sort of community and basically make people realize that they're part of the working class. And then basically everybody, as the early socialists say, everybody's part of this working class who does some sort of work, either with their hands or intellectually. I mean, that changes then again, right, later on. But at the beginning, really, like also the guys who write for newspapers are working class. The only like sort of not part of the working class is like the sort of aristocracy who doesn't do any work, and some like guys who own factories maybe. But like everybody who has a small shop is also working class, not only the guys who work in factories, so little anyways, that wouldn't be a good platform. But that sort of press, for example, like the sort of specialization in press, that's early, that's there from the beginning in a way. But then there's probably something happening, a professionalization blowing up of the press, maybe subscription numbers, I don't like maybe more specialized journals, these sort of things, right? So I think it's our job to be just extremely specific and sort of make sure that these categories work for our specific periods. Yeah, well, thanks. Yeah.
So, any other question, any other commentary? So, we have to remember that we can download the Anne's book. So it's
legally and illegally.
Illegally, okay.
And if you can't, because you're a law-abiding citizen, send me an email. I'm happy to send it to you as well.
Okay. Okay.
So
we will read your book and to the proof in your research. So we can say goodbye. We can finish the session.
Sure.
Thank you everybody for coming, and thank you Anne as well.
No, thank you. Really appreciate it. Yes.
Okay. See you.
Thank you very
Thanks
much.
very much.
Thanks.
Bye.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.
Yes.
See you next time for the
Bye.
next session.
Bye.
Bye.